The Tudor dynasty, one of history's most celebrated royal lineages, was built upon the broken body of a 13-year-old girl. This is not a fairy tale of princesses and castles, but a testament to how power was carved from the flesh of children in medieval England. Margaret Beaufort's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The foundations of our most revered institutions were often laid through unspeakable suffering. When we speak of the Tudors, we envision Henry VIII's 6 wives, Elizabeth I's golden age, or the grandeur of Hampton Court. Yet few know that this dynasty's very existence depended on a child bride who nearly died giving birth at 13. The transformation from traumatized child to the most powerful woman in England reveals both the depths of medieval cruelty and the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit. In 1455, as the Wars of the Roses tore England apart, a 12-year-old girl was sold into marriage like livestock. Her name was Margaret Beaufort, and her story would reshape English history. But first, she would endure horrors that modern society would rightfully condemn as child abuse and sexual assault. This is not merely a historical account. It is a reckoning with how civilizations have built their glory on the suffering of their most vulnerable members. The medieval world operated on different moral principles than our own, yet some truths transcend time. Children should be protected, not exploited. Margaret's story exposes the hypocrisy of an era that claimed divine authority while sanctioning the rape of children for political gain. Her eventual rise to power serves as both an inspiration and an indictment of a system that required such sacrifice. Today, as we grapple with ongoing issues of child marriage and exploitation worldwide, Margaret Beaufort's experience resonates with disturbing relevance. Millions of girls still face forced marriages they cannot consent to. Understanding her journey helps us comprehend how progress has been made and how far we still have to go. This account will not romanticize medieval life or excuse its brutalities under the guise of different times. Instead, it will present the raw truth of how a child's trauma became the cornerstone of royal power. Margaret Beaufort deserves to be remembered not just as Henry VII's mother or a political mastermind, but as a survivor who transformed her pain into purpose. As we delve into her story, prepare to confront uncomfortable realities about power, gender, and childhood in medieval England. This is not entertainment, but education. A necessary examination of how societies have historically failed their children and how individual resilience can emerge from systemic cruelty. Margaret's journey challenges us to see beyond the pageantry of history to its human cost. Her story begins in 1443, in a world where childhood was a luxury few could afford, and where noble girls were pawns in a deadly game of thrones. What happened to Margaret Beaufort would be considered criminal today, yet in her time it was simply politics. This is her story, unflinching, unvarnished, and ultimately unforgettable. 15th century England was a realm in chaos, torn between the rival houses of Lancaster and York, in what history would later call the Wars of the Roses. Noble families shifted allegiances like weather vanes, and marriages were not unions of love, but calculated moves on a political chessboard. Into this world of constant warfare and shifting loyalties, Margaret Beaufort was born on May 31st, 1443, at Bletsoe Castle in Bedfordshire. The England of Margaret's birth was a paradox of chivalric ideals and brutal realities. While troubadours sang of courtly love and noble knights, the actual treatment of women reflected harsh pragmatism. Noble daughters were valuable assets, their wombs potential treaties, their virginity a commodity to be traded for land, titles, and political advantage. The Church, which might have protected them, instead sanctioned these arrangements, blessing unions that today would warrant criminal prosecution. Margaret's father, John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, died when she was barely a year old, possibly by suicide following military disgrace. This early loss would define her entire life, leaving her a wealthy heiress, but also desperately vulnerable. In medieval England, an heiress without male protection was like a sheep among wolves. Her lands and titles made her one of the most sought-after prizes in the marriage market. The concept of childhood, as we understand it, did not exist in medieval noble society. While peasant children might enjoy some years of relative innocence, noble children were miniature adults from the moment they could walk. Girls were especially burdened, trained from infancy for their future roles as wives and mothers. They learned to manage households, embroider, and most crucially, to be obedient. Canon law technically set the age of consent at 12 for girls and 14 for boys, but this was for marriage, not consummation. Custom dictated waiting until at least 14 before sexual relations, recognizing that younger bodies were not ready for childbirth. However, these protections were often ignored when political necessity demanded. The Church's complicity in these violations reveals how even religious authority bent to political power. The medical understanding of the female body in the 15th century was primitive and often dangerously wrong. Physicians believed in the four humors and thought women were simply imperfect men. They had no real comprehension of adolescent development or the dangers of early pregnancy. This ignorance, combined with political greed, created a perfect storm of circumstances that would nearly kill Margaret Beaufort and countless other child brides. The Wars of the Roses intensified the already brutal marriage politics of the era. As the Lancastrians and Yorkists battled for the throne, every noble family scrambled to secure their position through strategic alliances. Children became pawns moved rapidly across this deadly board, their personal desires or physical readiness irrelevant to the greater game. Margaret, with her royal blood and vast inheritance, was one of the most valuable pieces in play. By 1450, England had descended into near anarchy. The weak King Henry VI suffered from mental illness, leaving a power vacuum that ambitious nobles rushed to fill. In this atmosphere of uncertainty and violence, controlling an heiress like Margaret Beaufort meant access to wealth, land, and legitimate claims to power. Her childhood ended not with a gradual transition to adulthood, but with a sudden, brutal thrust into the violent world of medieval politics. At age 9, Margaret was already being bartered between potential husbands. Her first betrothal was to John de la Pole, son of the Duke of Suffolk, but this was dissolved when Suffolk fell from power. The casual breaking of these contracts reveals how little the feelings or well-being of the children involved mattered. Margaret was not asked her opinion. She was simply informed of her fate. This pattern would drive her later determination to control her own destiny. The medieval manor where Margaret spent her early years was a world of contrasts. While she enjoyed material comfort, fine clothes, adequate food, and physical safety, she lived under constant psychological pressure. Every visiting nobleman was a potential husband, every political shift a threat to her security. She was educated to be pious and obedient, yet the adults around her demonstrated that power, not virtue, ruled their world. Margaret's mother, Margaret Beauchamp, remarried quickly after her father's death, as was expected of noble widows. This left young Margaret even more isolated, a valuable property managed by guardians whose primary interest was maximizing their own profit from her eventual marriage. The concept of acting in a child's best interest was foreign to medieval guardianship. By her 10th birthday, Margaret had already learned the harsh lessons of her world, that her purpose was to breed heirs, and that her survival depended on navigating the treacherous waters of court politics. These early experiences forged a character of remarkable resilience and determination. The stage was set for tragedy. In 1453, as 11-year-old Margaret continued her education in household management and religious devotion, Edmund Tudor was granted wardship over her. The son of Owen Tudor and Catherine of Valois, Edmund had royal connections but little wealth. Margaret represented his chance to establish a dynasty. What followed would be a case study in how medieval society's treatment of children as property could lead to devastating consequences. The dissolution of Margaret's betrothal to John de la Pole marked a turning point in her young life. At 12 years old, she found herself at the center of a bidding war between two powerful men, Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, and William de la Pole. Both saw in Margaret not a child to be protected, but a prize to be won. The King's Council, influenced by Tudor's close relationship with King Henry VI, awarded wardship to Edmund. Edmund Tudor was 24 years old when he gained control of 12-year-old Margaret, a man in his prime taking possession of a child. Contemporary sources describe him as ambitious and calculating, qualities that served him well in the dangerous political landscape of the 1450s. His half-brother King Henry VI had elevated him from relative obscurity to the earldom of Richmond, but Edmund wanted more. Margaret's bloodline and wealth offered him the legitimacy and resources he craved. The speed with which Edmund moved to secure his prize reveals his true motivations. Within months of gaining her wardship, he had married Margaret and, breaking all social conventions, consummated the marriage immediately. Custom dictated waiting until a girl was at least 14 before consummation, recognizing the physical dangers of early pregnancy. Edmund's actions were driven by greed. If Margaret died before producing an heir, her estates would revert to the crown. The wedding itself was a hasty affair, conducted at Bletsoe Castle in 1455. Margaret, dressed in the finery befitting her status, spoke vows she was too young to fully understand. The ceremony, blessed by the church, sanctified what modern law would recognize as child abuse. No one recorded Margaret's feelings about her wedding day, but later events suggest she understood the danger she was in. What happened next can only be described as sanctioned rape. A 12-year-old cannot consent to sex with an adult, regardless of historical context. Edmund's decision to immediately consummate the marriage was motivated by one factor: securing Margaret's inheritance through pregnancy. If she bore his child, her estates would remain with the Tudor family even if she died. This calculated cruelty was perfectly legal in medieval England. Margaret became pregnant almost immediately, a testament to Edmund's relentless pursuit of an heir. For a 12-year-old body, pregnancy was extraordinarily dangerous. Her pelvis had not finished developing. Her body was not ready for the demands of carrying a child. Medieval medical knowledge offered no help, as physicians believed young women were simply smaller versions of mature women. As Margaret's pregnancy progressed, Edmund Tudor's political position became increasingly precarious. The Wars of the Roses had entered a particularly violent phase, with Lancastrian and Yorkist forces clashing across England. In August 1456, he was captured by William Herbert and imprisoned at Carmarthen Castle. The man who had shown no mercy to a child would receive none himself. Edmund Tudor died in captivity on November 3, 1456, possibly from plague, though some suspected poison. He left behind a 13-year-old widow, 7 months pregnant with his child. Margaret, isolated at Pembroke Castle in Wales, faced the prospect of childbirth without her mother, without experienced midwives, and without hope of survival if complications arose. The winter of 1456 was particularly harsh, adding to her misery. Margaret's brother-in-law, Jasper Tudor, took responsibility for her care after Edmund's death. Unlike his brother, Jasper showed genuine concern for Margaret's welfare, though there was little he could do to ease her situation. He ensured she had the best care available, but in medieval Wales, this meant little more than basic comfort and the attendance of local women who served as midwives. As Christmas approached, Margaret entered the final stages of pregnancy. At 13 years old, she faced what many grown women feared: childbirth in an age when it was the leading cause of death for women. Her small stature and youth compounded the dangers. The castle prepared for the worst while hoping for a miracle. The tragedy of Margaret's situation extends beyond her personal suffering. Across medieval Europe, countless girls endured similar fates, their stories lost to history. Margaret's experience was exceptional only in its consequences, not its cruelty. She represented thousands of nameless child brides sacrificed on the altar of political ambition. January 28, 1457, began like any other winter day at Pembroke Castle, but it would end with an event that changed English history. Margaret Beaufort, 13 years old and small for her age, went into labor. What followed was a nightmare that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Labor began in the early morning hours, catching the household somewhat by surprise. Margaret's young body immediately struggled with contractions it was not developed enough to handle effectively. The midwives, experienced with normal births, found themselves confronting a medical emergency they were ill-equipped to manage. As hours passed, it became clear this would not be a normal delivery. Margaret's narrow pelvis, not yet fully developed, could not accommodate the baby's passage. In modern medicine, this would be recognized as cephalopelvic disproportion, requiring immediate cesarean section. In 1457, it meant prolonged agony with death as the likely outcome. The midwives could only offer herbal remedies and prayers. Contemporary accounts, while sparse on medical details, suggest the labor lasted over 30 hours. For a 13-year-old already weakened by pregnancy, this was torture beyond description. Margaret later spoke of this experience only obliquely, but her actions throughout life suggested deep trauma. She would never attempt pregnancy again, despite 2 subsequent marriages. The birth chamber became a scene of desperate struggle. Margaret, delirious with pain and exhaustion, fought for consciousness as her body tore itself apart trying to deliver the child. Blood loss was significant, and several times the midwives believed they had lost her. Jasper Tudor paced outside, aware that he might lose both his sister-in-law and his nephew in one terrible day. Finally, after hours of agony that damaged Margaret's body permanently, Henry Tudor was born. The baby was small but alive, his cries a miracle in a room that had expected only death. But the cost of his survival was written on his mother's broken body. The trauma of the birth had caused severe tearing and damage to Margaret's reproductive system. The immediate aftermath was touch and go. Margaret hemorrhaged severely, and infection was a constant threat in an age before antibiotics. For days, she hovered between life and death, while the household focused on keeping the newborn Henry alive. Recovery took months. Margaret remained bedridden for weeks, her body struggling to heal from injuries that would never fully mend. The psychological impact was equally severe, but less visible. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not a recognized condition in medieval times, but Margaret exhibited many of its symptoms throughout her life. She became hypervigilant about control, obsessed with order and planning. The 13-year-old girl, who nearly died giving birth, emerged as a woman armored against further vulnerability. Margaret's relationship with her son was shaped by their traumatic beginning. She was fiercely protective of Henry, perhaps seeing in his survival a meaning for her suffering. Yet she was also distant in ways that suggested emotional self-preservation. Having been forced into motherhood through violence, she struggled to separate maternal love from its traumatic origin. The permanent physical damage meant Margaret would never bear another child, devastating in a society that valued women primarily for reproduction. Her subsequent marriages would be political alliances uncomplicated by pregnancy possibility. This infertility, caused by childhood rape and traumatic birth, paradoxically freed her to pursue power in ways that multiple pregnancies would have prevented. Word of Margaret's ordeal spread through the Welsh marches and beyond. Even in an age accustomed to young brides, her case was recognized as extreme. Some saw divine intervention in her survival, interpreting her suffering as God's test of a special soul. This religious interpretation helped Margaret frame her trauma in terms she could endure. The immediate political implications were significant. Henry Tudor's birth made him a potential claimant to the English throne through his mother's Beaufort lineage. More importantly, it established Margaret as a player rather than a pawn in the political game. Having paid such a terrible price for her son's existence, she would dedicate her life to ensuring his survival and success. In the dark winter of 1457, as Margaret lay recovering from her ordeal, she made decisions that would echo through history. She would remarry for protection, but never again allow her body to be used as breeding ground for male ambition. She would accumulate power and wealth as armor against vulnerability. Most importantly, she would ensure that her son would claim the throne that made her suffering meaningful. Years later, Margaret would found Christ's College at Cambridge, establishing in its statutes special protections for young students. She never explicitly connected this to her own experience, but the emphasis on protecting youth from exploitation speaks volumes. The child bride who nearly died at 13 would live to see her son crowned King of England, but the cost of that crown was written on her body forever. Following her traumatic childbirth and slow recovery, Margaret Beaufort needed protection in the chaotic landscape of the Wars of the Roses. As a 13-year-old widow with a valuable inheritance and a potential royal claimant as a son, she was dangerously vulnerable. Her guardian, Jasper Tudor, negotiated her second marriage to Henry Stafford, second son of the Duke of Buckingham. This union, contracted in 1458, would prove to be the most personally compatible of Margaret's marriages. Henry Stafford was 23 when he married 14-year-old Margaret, but unlike Edmund Tudor, he showed no urgency to consummate the marriage. Whether from personal decency or awareness of Margaret's physical condition, Stafford allowed their relationship to develop gradually. Contemporary accounts suggest theirs was a partnership of mutual respect, with Stafford supporting Margaret's intellectual pursuits and religious devotion. During her marriage to Stafford, Margaret began to display the political acumen that would later make her legendary. She managed her estates with remarkable efficiency, turning properties that had been neglected during her first marriage into profitable enterprises. This was unusual for a woman of her time, but Margaret's traumatic experiences had taught her that economic power meant personal security. The physical consequences of her childhood pregnancy became apparent during these years. Medical historians studying contemporary accounts believe Margaret suffered from chronic pelvic pain, stress incontinence, and possibly rectovaginal fistula, common complications of traumatic childbirth in young girls. These conditions, untreatable in medieval times, meant constant discomfort and social embarrassment. Margaret's relationship with her son Henry remained complex during his childhood. Separated by political necessity, Henry lived with his uncle Jasper in Wales, while Margaret resided in England. Their bond was maintained through letters and brief visits. Her correspondence reveals a mother desperate to protect her child while struggling with emotional distance her trauma had created. The Stafford years saw Margaret develop her legendary information network. Understanding that knowledge meant power, she cultivated relationships with merchants, clergy, and minor nobility across England. By her 20s, Margaret knew more about English political currents than many great lords. This network would prove invaluable in the turbulent years ahead. Margaret's religious devotion deepened during this period, but it took distinctive forms shaped by her experiences. She was particularly drawn to female saints who had suffered physical trials. Her Book of Hours, still surviving, shows marginalia focusing on passages about suffering transformed into spiritual strength. Religion offered her a framework for understanding and transcending her trauma. The social dynamics of Margaret's second marriage reveal how her reputation had been affected by her first pregnancy. Despite her high birth and wealth, she was viewed differently than other noble wives. The damage to her body was known in court circles, making her an object of pity and whispered speculation. Margaret responded by cultivating an image of austere dignity. In 1461, the Yorkist victory at Towton forced Margaret to navigate carefully. Her son, Henry Tudor, as a Lancastrian claimant, was now in mortal danger. Margaret and Stafford publicly submitted to Edward IV, while secretly maintaining contact with Lancastrian exiles. This period taught Margaret the art of political dissimulation, appearing to submit while actively plotting. Margaret's intellectual pursuits flourished during her marriage to Stafford. Denied the possibility of more children, she channeled her energy into education. She learned French and some Latin, unusual for women of her time, and began collecting books. Her library included not just religious texts, but chronicles and legal documents. The management of chronic pain shaped Margaret's daily life in ways contemporary chronicles only hint at. She developed rigid routines, early rising, structured prayer times, careful diet, that modern medicine recognizes as pain management strategies. Her famous austerity may have been as much physical necessity as religious devotion. Henry Stafford's death in 1471 ended Margaret's most stable period. On his deathbed, he urged her to remarry quickly for protection, understanding the dangers facing a widow with Lancastrian connections. Within a year, she had married Thomas Stanley, a powerful lord with the crucial ability to play both sides in the ongoing conflict. This marriage was purely strategic. Margaret's third marriage contract reveals how much she had learned about self-protection. She negotiated unprecedented terms, control of her own properties, separate households when desired, and explicit agreements about personal autonomy. Her trauma had forged a woman who would never again be anyone's property. The Stanley marriage was a business partnership dressed in marital clothes. Thomas Stanley, later Earl of Derby, was a cunning political operator who recognized Margaret's value as an ally rather than merely a wife. They lived largely separate lives, coming together for political purposes. This arrangement suited Margaret perfectly. During the Stanley years, Margaret's long-term planning for her son's future intensified. Henry Tudor remained in exile, but Margaret worked tirelessly to build support for his eventual return. Every alliance she forged, every piece of information she gathered, served this ultimate purpose. The psychological strategies Margaret developed to cope with her trauma became political assets. Hypervigilance made her an excellent judge of character and situation. Emotional numbing allowed her to make ruthless decisions without sentiment. By 1483, when Edward IV died unexpectedly, Margaret had positioned herself perfectly for the chaos that followed. Her intelligence network alerted her to Richard III's intentions before he acted. Her alliances gave her options others lacked. Her wealth provided resources for action. When opportunity arose, she was ready. The usurpation of Richard III and the disappearance of the princes in the Tower created the opening Margaret had waited for. She orchestrated a conspiracy of stunning complexity, coordinating Lancastrian exiles, disaffected Yorkists, and foreign supporters. Her role in planning Henry Tudor's invasion of 1485 cannot be overstated. While her husband Stanley maintained plausible deniability, Margaret coordinated communications, arranged financing, and built the coalition that would topple Richard III. The conspiracy required Margaret to risk everything. Discovery would mean execution for treason, but she had already survived the unsurvivable. Richard III's threats held less terror for someone who had faced death at 13. As 1485 dawned, Margaret Beaufort stood on the precipice of either triumph or disaster. Her son Henry prepared to invade England with a small force and a weak claim. Success depended on the alliances Margaret had forged and the reputation she had built. August 22, 1485 marked the culmination of Margaret Beaufort's three-decade journey from victim to victor. The Battle of Bosworth Field, where her son Henry Tudor defeated Richard III, was won as much by Margaret's political machinations as by military might. Her husband Thomas Stanley's last-minute intervention, secretly coordinated with Margaret, tipped the balance decisively. Henry VII's coronation transformed Margaret from conspirator to king's mother. a position of unprecedented influence. At 42, she had achieved what seemed impossible for a woman of her time, real political power. But this triumph came with its own complexities. The trauma that had driven her to this pinnacle didn't disappear with success. Margaret's influence over her son was absolute, yet carefully exercised. Their correspondence reveals a relationship of formal devotion underlaid with steel. Henry, aware of the price his mother had paid for his existence, rarely opposed her directly. Margaret signed herself Margaret R., maintaining her first husband's initial even in triumph, a psychological scar that success couldn't erase. The establishment of Henry VII's household saw Margaret take unprecedented control. She wrote detailed ordinances governing every aspect of court life, from meal service to chamber arrangements. This obsession with control makes sense when viewed through the lens of trauma. The woman who had been utterly powerless as a child now micromanaged an entire kingdom's domestic arrangements. Margaret's treatment of her daughter-in-law, Elizabeth of York, revealed the complexities of her trauma's legacy. Elizabeth, married at 20 to Henry VII, received Margaret's protection from early pregnancy, but also her domination. Margaret controlled Elizabeth's household, limited her independence, and essentially reduced the Queen of England to a subordinate position. Financial control became another expression of Margaret's need for security. Despite vast wealth, she maintained detailed account books and questioned every expenditure. Servants reported her checking logs personally and counting plate obsessively. This behavior, seen as miserliness by contemporaries, was trauma, manifesting as hypervigilance. Margaret's religious patronage took forms directly connected to her experiences. She founded Christ's College, Cambridge, with statutes protecting young students from exploitation. She endowed chantries specifically for women who died in childbirth. Her charitable giving focused on vulnerable women and children, the demographics she had belonged to when Edmund Tudor destroyed her childhood. The physical consequences of her teenage pregnancy continued throughout Margaret's life. Court records mention her frequent retreats for health reasons, likely managing chronic pain flare-ups. She developed elaborate routines around diet, exercise, and rest that modern medicine recognizes as chronic illness management. Margaret's relationship with other noble women was marked by distance and formality. Having been betrayed by the very systems meant to protect her, she struggled to form intimate friendships. Her ladies reported kindness but not warmth, generosity but not affection. The emotional numbing that had helped her survive made genuine connection difficult. In 1489, Margaret faced a situation that must have triggered every trauma in her body. Her granddaughter, Margaret Tudor, was betrothed to James IV of Scotland at age 11. Despite Margaret Beaufort's enormous influence, she could not prevent this child marriage. Watching her granddaughter prepared for the same fate she had endured must have been agonizing. She did what she could, delaying the actual marriage until Margaret Tudor was 14. The Spanish marriage negotiations for Prince Arthur revealed Margaret's protective instincts. She fought to delay Catherine of Aragon's arrival until both parties were older. When Arthur died shortly after the marriage, Margaret's grief was compounded by relief. Her grandson had not lived to perpetuate the cycle of forcing children to bear children. Margaret's later years saw her accumulate titles and powers usually reserved for men. She was declared a femme sole, able to hold property and make contracts independently of any husband. She took vows of chastity, formally removing herself from the marriage market that had commodified her. These legal maneuvers were the older woman protecting herself in ways the 12-year-old could not. The succession of her grandson Henry VIII in 1509 marked Margaret's final triumph. She had lived to see her bloodline secure on the throne, her son's dynasty established beyond challenge. At the coronation, she was given precedence over all other women, walking immediately behind the new king. Yet even in triumph, trauma's shadows lingered. Witnesses reported Margaret weeping throughout the ceremony. Margaret's final months were spent establishing her legacy. She updated her will obsessively, ensuring her charitable foundations would survive her. She dictated detailed instructions for her funeral, controlling her death as she had learned to control her life. Every bequest, every instruction revealed a woman still fighting for agency. Margaret Beaufort died on June 29, 1509, just days after her grandson's coronation. Her last words were reported as prayers, but her final actions spoke louder. She had arranged everything, controlled everything, prepared for every contingency. She faced her end as she had faced her life after trauma, with rigid control and iron will. The England Margaret left behind bore her stamp in ways both obvious and subtle. The Tudor dynasty she had bought with blood would rule for over a century. The educational institutions she founded would outlive kingdoms, but perhaps her most lasting legacy was demonstrating that trauma could be transformed into triumph, even if the scars never fully healed. Modern historians debate Margaret Beaufort's legacy. Some see her as a proto-feminist who carved out unprecedented power in a patriarchal world. Others view her as a traumatized woman who perpetuated cycles of control and manipulation. Both readings are true. Margaret was simultaneously victim and victor, broken child and powerful woman. She had indeed become England's most powerful woman, but power had not repaired the breaking. Instead, Margaret Beaufort had built an empire on her scars, transforming pain into politics. Her story reminds us that survival is not the same as healing, that success cannot erase suffering. Margaret Beaufort's transformation from child victim to political powerhouse illuminates the entire structure of medieval society that enabled such suffering. Her story forces us to confront how civilizations built their glory on the broken bodies of children. The Tudor dynasty's foundation on a 13-year-old's traumatic childbirth exemplifies how power was constructed in medieval Europe. The immediate legacy of Margaret's ordeal was felt within her own family. Her son, Henry VII, perhaps influenced by his mother's experience, showed unusual concern for his daughter's marriages. While political necessity still ruled, he demonstrated more consideration for their ages and readiness than was typical. His daughter Margaret Tudor's marriage to Scotland was delayed until she was 14. Yet the system that brutalized Margaret Beaufort continued largely unchanged. Throughout the 16th century, noble girls across Europe continued to be married as children. Margaret's individual triumph did not translate into systemic reform. The institutions she had mastered remained committed to treating female children as property. The Protestant Reformation, beginning shortly after Margaret's death, brought some scrutiny to marriage practices. Reformers questioned various Catholic traditions, including the Church's complicity in child marriages. Yet even Protestant nations continued the practice well into the modern era. Margaret's contemporary, Catherine of Aragon, would see her own marriage troubles partly stem from questions about consummation age. Margaret's educational foundations had more lasting impact. Christ's College and St. John's College, Cambridge, became centers of learning that offered alternatives to the martial culture that had victimized her. By promoting scholarship and religious contemplation, these institutions provided paths to influence that didn't require women to sacrifice their bodies. The evolution of English law regarding marriage and consent shows glacial progress from Margaret's time. The Hardwicke Marriage Act of 1753 finally required parental consent for minors under 21, but 12-year-old girls could still legally marry with permission. It wasn't until the 20th century that England established meaningful protections for children from sexual exploitation through marriage. Modern analysis of Margaret Beaufort often focuses on her as a strong woman who overcame adversity, but this framing risks romanticizing trauma. Her strength was a survival mechanism, not an inspirational choice. Celebrating her resilience without condemning the system that necessitated it perpetuates harmful narratives about suffering building character. The psychological profile of Margaret Beaufort offers insights into trauma's long-term effects. Her hypervigilance, need for control, emotional distance, and psychosomatic illnesses align perfectly with modern understanding of complex PTSD. Her coping mechanisms were adaptive responses to extreme trauma. Understanding her behavior through this lens transforms her from a cold, calculating woman into a comprehensible trauma survivor. Contemporary child marriage remains a global crisis, with 12 million girls married annually before age 18. Margaret Beaufort's story resonates not as ancient history, but as ongoing reality. From Afghanistan to Zimbabwe, girls continue to suffer forced pregnancy, traumatic childbirth, and lifelong consequences. The medieval brutality that nearly killed Margaret persists. The complicity of religious institutions in child marriage continues today. Various faiths still sanctify unions that secular law would criminalize. The same arguments used in medieval England, tradition, religious law, family honor, justify ongoing abuse. Margaret's experience demonstrates how religious authority can enable rather than prevent child exploitation. Medical understanding has advanced enormously since Margaret's time, revealing the full horror of what she endured. We now know that pregnancy before age 15 carries severe risks: obstetric fistula, pelvic floor dysfunction, chronic pain, and psychological trauma. Margaret's probable injuries would have made every day a struggle. Her achievements become even more remarkable, understanding the physical suffering she endured. The economic drivers of child marriage remain consistent from Margaret's era to today. Poverty, property rights, and patriarchal control create conditions where girls' bodies become commodities. Margaret's value as an heiress made her a target. Modern girls face similar exploitation for dowries, bride prices, or family debts. Margaret Beaufort's coping strategies offer both inspiration and warning for modern trauma survivors. Her transformation of pain into power demonstrates resilience, but her perpetuation of controlling behaviors shows how unhealed trauma creates cycles. Modern therapeutic understanding emphasizes healing over mere survival. The romanticization of medieval times often obscures realities like Margaret's experience. Popular culture presents knights and ladies while ignoring the systematic brutalization of children. Margaret's story provides necessary correction to sanitized historical narratives. The Middle Ages were not a fairy tale, but an era where powerful men routinely raped children with social and religious sanction. Legal reforms protecting children evolved slowly after Margaret's time. The Age of Consent Act 1885 finally raised the age of consent to 16 in England, but this came 4 centuries after Margaret's ordeal. Each incremental reform faced resistance from those who benefited from exploiting children. The intersection of gender, age, and class in Margaret's victimization remains relevant to contemporary analysis. As a noble girl, she had privileges but also unique vulnerabilities. Modern trafficking and exploitation show similar patterns. Privilege provides no protection when systems enable predation. Margaret Beaufort's religious faith shaped English Christianity. Her devotional practices, charitable foundations, and patronage of religious education influenced Tudor-era spirituality. Yet her faith also enabled her survival of a system the Church sanctioned. This complex relationship between personal faith and institutional complicity continues challenging religious communities addressing abuse. The artistic and literary legacy of Margaret's era rarely acknowledged experiences like hers. Contemporary chronicles focused on battles and dynasties, not the suffering that enabled them. Modern historians have worked to recover these suppressed narratives, understanding that history's grand sweep consists of individual traumas. Educational curricula addressing medieval history must grapple with stories like Margaret's. teaching about the Wars of the Roses or Tudor dynasty without acknowledging the child abuse that enabled them perpetuates harmful silences. Margaret's experience provides age-appropriate ways to discuss difficult historical realities while connecting past and present human rights concerns. The transformation of trauma into political power offers complex lessons. While Margaret's achievement remains remarkable, it came at tremendous cost. Modern movements for survivor empowerment must balance celebrating resilience with addressing how unhealed trauma perpetuates harm. Margaret Beaufort died having lived to see her bloodline secure on England's throne. Her final days were spent in prayer and careful arrangement of her affairs. She remained both inspiration and warning, proof that victims can seize power and evidence of trauma's lasting damage. Modern readers encountering Margaret's story must resist comfortable historical distance. The forces that nearly killed her persist globally. Her ordeal is not medieval curiosity, but contemporary crisis. Understanding how she survived and thrived offers insights for addressing ongoing injustices. The final measure of Margaret Beaufort's legacy lies not in the dynasty she created, but in the questions her life raises. How do societies create conditions where children's bodies become commodities? What systems enable abuse? How do survivors transform trauma into agency? These questions demand answers today. Margaret Beaufort's transformation stands as history's indictment and human resilience's testament. Born into a world that valued her only as breeding stock, she seized control through intelligence, will, and strategic brilliance. Yet her triumph came at terrible cost. She built a dynasty on her broken body and an empire on her scars. The Tudor rose grows from soil, fertilized by a child's blood. This metaphor captures the brutal truth of how power reproduces itself through violence against the vulnerable. Margaret's son, Henry VII, united the roses of York and Lancaster, but that unity was purchased through his mother's childhood suffering. We cannot celebrate Margaret Beaufort's achievements without acknowledging their cost. She was simultaneously victim and victor, broken child and brilliant politician, trauma survivor and power broker. Her complexity defies simple categorization. She was both, neither, and something uniquely herself. The lessons of Margaret's life speak directly to contemporary struggles. Millions of girls worldwide face child marriage, forced pregnancy, and systematic exploitation. Her survival required extraordinary individual effort. Modern justice demands systemic change, preventing such suffering entirely. History must remember Margaret Beaufort not as an inspiring story of overcoming adversity, but as evidence of adversity that should never have existed. Her brilliance, determination, and achievement stand separate from the trauma that sparked them. She deserved protection, not exploitation, childhood, not child marriage. Margaret's legacy encompasses Tudor monarchs and Cambridge colleges, political brilliance and educational patronage. Yet it also includes chronic pain and emotional distance, hypervigilance and compulsive control. Trauma's alchemy transformed a victim into a victor, but lead remains lead even when gilded with gold. In the end, Margaret Beaufort's story is not one of triumph over adversity, but of survival despite atrocity. She was a child who deserved protection, received exploitation, and somehow fashioned from that violation a life of meaning and power. Her transformation stands as both human resilience's monument and systematic injustice's indictment. May her memory serve not as inspiration to endure suffering, but as motivation to prevent it. The dynasty she built has crumbled, but the institutions she founded endure. More importantly, the questions her life raises about power, gender, childhood, and trauma remain urgently relevant. Margaret Beaufort's broken body built a kingdom. Let her story help build a world where no child's body is ever again broken for power's sake.